The Archivist of Obsidian Ridge. The mountain was not called Obsidian Ridge for its colour, but for the feeling it instilled, a cold, dark sharpness that promised breakage. Elias Thorne knew this feeling intimately. For 15 years he had been the sole archivist and caretaker of the Blackwood Library, a monolithic structure of grey granite nestled in a remote saddle of the ridge, well above the snowline. The library contained no books of renown, no first editions or popular fiction. It housed the private collection of the late industrialist Alistair Blackwood, a vast labyrinthine assemblage of obscure journals, forgotten manuscripts and documents. They were, in essence, the records of things the world had deliberately chosen to forget. Elias lived in silence, save for the rhythmic creak of the aging pipes in the sub-basement, the constant, abrasive wind that scraped against the granite walls. His only company was the temperature-controlled air, the smell of ancient paper and dried ink, the oppressive weight of the secrets he catalogued. The year was 1987, a winter storm, heralded by the Weather Service as unprecedented, had sealed the mountain passes weeks early, locking Elias into an isolation deeper than any he had previously known. The satellite phone was dead, the snowdrifts were 20 feet high, and the backup generator's fuel tank was dangerously low. Elias was a man of routine. Every morning he checked the climate control. Every afternoon he processed a stack of 15 manuscripts. Every evening he ate a can of soup by the small sputtering fire in his private study. But 3 days into the great isolation, the routine broke. It began with the third sublevel. The Blackwood Library descended deeper than it ascended. The third sublevel was its deepest, most rarely accessed point. It was reserved for artifacts and records deemed too volatile for sunlight or casual handling. Items wrapped in lead foil, bound in iron, or simply too fragile to move. Elias had a map, but the map itself was an artifact, detailing corridors that seemed to twist and reform in the decades since it was drawn. On the third day of the isolation, as the storm howled, Elias noticed a discrepancy in the inventory system. A manuscript, catalogued only as the Index of Whispered Names, was missing its entry date. A simple clerical error, perhaps, but Elias was meticulous. He checked the physical location, Bay 4, Shelf C, Container 11. It was empty. The surrounding containers, marked as containing documents relating to the chronology of null points, were present, covered in a thin, undisturbed layer of grey dust. He descended to the third sublevel. The air immediately grew colder, dense with a metallic tang he couldn't place. The lighting down here was minimal, single caged incandescent bulbs hanging over the main aisles. As he walked, his footsteps on the concrete floor echoed not once but twice, a fraction of a second apart, as if an invisible second person was following his pace. Bay 4 was against the eastern wall. Elias shined his heavy flashlight beam across the empty shelf. There was no disturbance in the dust, no sign the container had been violently removed. It was as if it had simply vanished from its spot, leaving the dust perfectly intact. Elias was rational. He attributed the event to a catastrophic memory error on his part, or perhaps a temporary transfer he had forgotten to log before the storm hit. He went back upstairs, logged the item as temporarily unlocated, and tried to resume his work. But the silence was now weighted. That night Elias was awoken not by a noise but by an absence of sound. The ceaseless, abrasive howl of the wind had abruptly ceased. The silence was absolute, a heavy cotton blanket pressing down on the eardrums. He checked his watch, 3:17 a.m. He grabbed his flashlight and walked out into the main reading room. The massive windows, usually rattling, were still. He looked out. The world outside was no longer white, it was black. The air was a static void. The snow had stopped, but the stars were gone, swallowed by a strange matte void that defied the laws of reflection. It was not merely night, it was the cancellation of light. As he stood there, a small wet snick echoed from the central circulatory stack, the 7-story tower of shelves that formed the core of the library. It sounded like the click of a brass latch being carefully, deliberately disengaged. Elias, armed with a healthy dose of fear and a heavy brass paperweight, moved toward the stack. He shone the light up the shelves. All was in order. Then he looked down. On the third landing down from his position, where the shadows pooled deepest, there was a faint, glistening smear on the polished oak floorboards. He crept down the winding stairs. The smear was wet and dark like thick motor oil, but it smelled of salt and ozone. As he bent closer, he saw that the liquid was not resting on the wood, but was actively being absorbed by it. And leading away from the smear, tracking into the deeper shadows of the peripheral aisles, were 4 distinct claw-like tracks. They were not from an animal. They had the rigid, unnatural spacing of something walking upright, but with appendages that ended in sharpened hooks. Elias fled back to his study, locked the heavy oak door and barricaded it with the archival trolley. He sat by the dwindling fire until dawn finally arrived, restoring the familiar grating noise of the wind, and crucially the natural laws of light and space. The next day, Elias refused to touch the inventory. He focused on maintenance, checking the boiler room in the basement. As he worked, he discovered something truly inexplicable in the ductwork near the ventilation intake. Tucked into a narrow vent, sealed tight against the intake fan, was a single sheet of paper. It was from the Index of Whispered Names. The sheet was brittle, transcribed in a thin, spidery hand, describing the ritual movements required to unspeak a name from the lexicon of memory. But it was the other side of the paper that made Elias's breath catch. It was a recent photograph, a faded Polaroid image of Elias himself, asleep in his study chair, taken from the corner of the room just above his head. He had never kept Polaroids in the library. More disturbingly, the clock in the photograph on the mantel showed 3:17 a.m. The realization was a punch to the gut. The thing that had taken the book was now bringing it back, page by page, delivered directly to him. Elias realized that the creature, the entity, was not trapped outside by the snow. It was trapped inside with him, and it was playing a methodical psychological game. The library was its hunting ground, and the artifacts were its medium of communication. He knew he had to find the remaining pages of the manuscript and put them back together. If the book contained methods for manipulating memory and reality, he couldn't let it be scattered. He spent the following days methodically checking the ventilation shafts, the cold air returns and the spaces between the shelves, always looking over his shoulder for the sign of the metallic, salt-smelling tracks. He found pieces in increasingly personal and disturbing locations. A page detailing how to de-link a soul was found pressed between the pages of his personal diary. A page describing the geometry of a null-point portal was pinned to the back of the small framed photo of his deceased wife. The spine and cover, now slimy with the dark liquid, were left chillingly on his pillow. On the 10th day, he was missing only the final 3 pages. He felt exhaustion creeping in, but also a manic determination. He was convinced that if the entity reassembled the complete text, it would achieve some kind of fundamental change in the library's reality, and by extension, his own. He decided to confront the deepest source of the library's secrecy, the 3rd sublevel, Bay 4. He descended, flashlight beam cutting through the metallic chill. This time the echoing footsteps were pronounced, clear and slightly faster than his own. He stopped, holding his breath, listening. The echoes stopped the instant he did. At Bay 4, he noticed that the dusty containers around the empty spot were no longer resting against the shelf. They were pulled out slightly, just a millimeter or two, but enough to show a sliver of darkness behind them. He realized the empty spot wasn't empty because the container was gone. It was empty because the shelf itself was the entrance. Elias, driven by the knowledge that the entity was close, grabbed the nearest container, a heavy lead-lined box marked null-point geometry. He pulled with all his strength. The entire section of shelving moved inward with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow, unlit space behind the wall. It was not a crawl space, but a cramped, low corridor, the air immediately heavy with the scent of ozone. He stepped inside. The corridor was only slightly wider than his shoulders. The ceiling was low, forcing him to hunch. He moved slowly, the beam of his light finding the walls covered not in concrete, but in what looked like fused black volcanic rock, obsidian. After maybe 50 feet, the corridor opened into a small subterranean chamber. It was circular, the ceiling lost in shadow, and in the center of the room, anchored to the floor by iron straps, was the missing container, Container 11. It was intact, but its brass latch was hanging open. Standing silently beside the container was the entity. It was not a beast or a shadow. It was tall and unnaturally thin, clothed in an archival smock identical to Elias's own. It was pale, nearly translucent, and utterly naked save for the smock. Its face was featureless, smooth, taut skin stretched over a skull-like structure with no mouth, no nose, and no ears. But where eyes should have been, there were 2 large, damp circles of dark liquid, like spilled crude oil, that glistened under Elias's light. The hands were the worst part, impossibly long and segmented, ending in the 4 sharp hooked claws he had seen imprinted on the floor upstairs. It was the Archivist of the 3rd sublevel, the entity that had maintained the Blackwood secrets for centuries. As Elias froze, the creature slowly raised one of its segmented hands. The long, hook-like fingers opened to reveal the final 3 pages of the index of whispered names. The pages were already damp with the dark liquid from its eyes. Then a voice, or rather a sound that bypassed the ear and resonated directly in Elias's mind, spoke, a dry, papery whisper. "You noticed the error." Elias couldn't move, he couldn't scream. The entity's blank face turned slightly, gesturing toward the open container 11 with the pages. "It is time to correct the ledger, to complete the set." The voice was not threatening but profoundly indifferent, the cold mandate of a machine tasked with an endless process. Elias realized the truth of the missing container. It wasn't gone. It had been reserved. The entity had been waiting for the new archivist, for the one who noticed the clerical error to find it. The entity had not been stealing the pages. It had been delivering them, priming Elias for this final meeting. The complete manuscript was the key to this null-point chamber, and the final 3 pages contained the final, most terrifying instruction. The creature's oily eyes fixed on Elias. The pages fluttered slightly. "The index requires a new name. To secure the boundary. To replace the temporary entry." Elias's flashlight beam, shaking violently, finally found the open container. He looked inside the box that had supposedly held the index. It didn't hold books, it held a single human skeleton. The bones were ancient, chalky white. But sitting where the skull should have been was a brittle, yellowed archivist's logbook bearing the year 1942. The final 3 pages slipped from the entity's grasp, falling slowly to the stone floor. Elias's eyes scanned the final sentence on the exposed page, the one detailing the temporary entry. "And the vessel must be the one who knows the contents, for knowledge is the required sacrifice to seal the place of unbecoming." The entity took a slow, deliberate step toward him, its featureless head tilted in an expression that was purely clinical. "Your knowledge is complete, Elias Thorne. The library requires permanence. The records must be updated." Elias tried to bolt, tried to scream, but the air in the obsidian chamber was too thick, too cold, pressing the sound back down his throat. He dropped the flashlight. It clattered and rolled, the beam catching on the wet, clawed tracks that were now rapidly covering the floor, leading straight toward his feet. The last thing he saw before the darkness enveloped him was the entity reaching out its impossibly long, segmented fingers, not to attack, but to calmly and meticulously adjust the collar of his archival smock, preparing the uniform for its inevitable, final position in the Blackwood Library's ledger of permanent entries. The storm outside remained silent. The temperature in the main library slowly lowered, ensuring the preservation of the records. And upstairs on the librarian's mantel the clock read 3:17 a.m. The only difference in the library the next morning was that a new empty container was waiting in Bay 4, Shelf C, in the 3rd sublevel, its dust layer perfectly intact. The only task remaining for the old archivist, now complete, was to wait for the next dedicated mind to notice the error in the inventory.